Let me ask you something that may sound simple on the surface, but if you let it sink in, it will uproot everything you've ever assumed about power, freedom, and control. What if the best government isn't the one that does the most, but the one that does the least? What if real strength in governance isn't measured by the number of policies, regulations, or interventions, but by the amount of space it gives its people to think, act, fail, and rise again? We live in a world where the illusion of safety has become more seductive than the reality of liberty. Every time something goes wrong, an economic downturn, a public health scare, a social conflict, we instinctively look upward to authority and ask, what will you do about it? But maybe, just maybe, that instinct is part of the problem. Maybe the strongest society is not the one where the government steps in most often, but the one in which the individuals, the communities, the families, and the culture itself are strong enough not to need constant intervention. And this is not an argument for chaos. It's an argument for maturity, both individual and collective. You see, when we talk about freedom, most people picture it as a kind of wild independence. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about earned freedom that comes with responsibility, inner discipline, and the capacity to govern oneself. A government that governs least is not necessarily passive. It's principled. It knows the boundary between protection and paternalism. It knows that every time it steps in to solve a problem that people could solve for themselves, it risks weakening the very muscles of autonomy that a healthy society depends on. Think of it like this: if a parent ties a child's shoes every day until they're 18, that child will never walk with confidence.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
The act of tying the shoes for them feels kind in the moment, but it's destructive in the long term. Now scale that up to a population of millions. A government that oversteps, even with good intentions, slowly erodes the people's capacity to act, to think, to take initiative. The paradox, then, is this: the more a government does for its people, the less the people feel capable of doing for themselves. And when that capability is lost, when people forget their own power, the cost is not just inefficiency, it's existential. A free people forget how to be free. So why does this happen? Why do we keep asking for more control, more oversight, more government? Because deep down, many of us are afraid of uncertainty, afraid of risk, afraid of being responsible for our own lives. It's easier to hand over that burden to someone else, but to say, you tell me what's right and wrong, you fix the economy, you protect me from discomfort. But here's the problem: the more we externalize responsibility, the more we internalize helplessness. And that helplessness becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We become the kind of people who need to be told what to do. We stop trusting our own judgment. We stop taking initiative. We stop solving problems at the local level. And before we know it, we're not citizens anymore, we're dependents. We've traded the risk of freedom for the illusion of safety. But history has shown us, again and again, that this trade never ends well. The government that gives you everything you want can also take everything you have. And if you've forgotten how to live without it, you won't even know where to begin when it does. Now let's take this a step deeper. What is the purpose of a government really? Is it to create utopia? Is it to fix every injustice, prevent every danger, anticipate every need? Or is it something simpler, something humbler, something more sustainable. The philosopher Henry David Thoreau once said, "That government is best which governs least." But he didn't mean no government. He meant a government that knows its place. A government whose job is to secure the space for human flourishing, not to impose a particular vision of what that flourishing should look like. A government that protects rights, enforces contracts, maintains order but leaves the rest to the people themselves. Because here's the raw truth: no central authority can ever know the hearts and minds of individuals better than they know themselves. No bureaucracy, no matter how well designed, can replicate the wisdom of lived experience, local knowledge, or personal responsibility. And when a government tries to do so, it doesn't just fail, it displaces the natural intelligence of society. It turns vibrant communities into passive consumers of state solutions. It turns culture into code. And the soul of a nation begins to atrophy. But we're not helpless in this. We're not doomed to dependency. The solution isn't to overthrow the government or reject all authority, it's to reframe the relationship. And to remember that the government is not a parent, and we are not children. It exists by the people, for the people not above them. And when we start to act like true citizens again, when we reclaim the habits of liberty, the disciplines of self-governance, the courage of personal initiative, then the government naturally shrinks. Not because we demand it, but because we no longer need it to fill the gaps we've learned to fill ourselves. Imagine a society where people solve problems without waiting for permission, where neighbors take care of each other, where businesses practice ethics without being forced, where communities innovate, adapt, and evolve from the bottom up. That's not a fantasy. That's the beginning of a stronger, freer world. And it starts with one question asked honestly: where have I outsourced my own power? The silent cost of good intentions, how overgovernance weakens the human spirit. Here's what no one tells you about control. It rarely arrives with a boot, it arrives with a hug. It shows up in the form of safety nets, protections, promises of equality, and the soothing language of care. It says, "Don't worry, we'll take it from here." And for a moment it feels good. It feels like relief. But slowly, quietly, it chips away at something sacred, our inner engine, our will, our sense of personal agency. Because every time someone else takes responsibility for our life, we lose a little of the muscle required to live it. We think of tyranny as something loud, something obvious, something that screams and stomps. But the most dangerous form of tyranny is the one that whispers, the one that cloaks itself in compassion, the one that governs too much, too often, not to take away freedom maliciously, but to protect people from the discomfort of having to make their own choices, police their own failures, bear their own burdens. And it's here, in this space of excessive good intentions, that the human spirit begins to quietly wither. Now you might ask, but what's wrong with the government trying to solve problems? Nothing. That's part of its role. The danger isn't in solving problems, it's in solving the wrong ones, or solving them in ways that rob people of their own growth. There's a difference between empowering and enabling, between helping someone stand and teaching them they can't stand without you. The latter is what overgovernance does. It creates dependency loops. It conditions people to believe they are incapable of self-regulation, incapable of civic engagement without a mandate, and incapable of creating value or solving disputes unless some higher authority scripts it all. And that belief, more than any law or policy, is what weakens a nation. Because once you believe you are incapable, no amount of external structure can save you. You lose the fire to build, to question, to create. You become passive. And a passive citizenry is fertile ground for authoritarianism, even if it arrives under the banner of progress. What makes this especially dangerous is that it feels so reasonable. Every inch of power that government expands is usually justified by a real problem. A crisis, a scandal, a tragedy, and we, the people, demand action. We say, do something, and they do. But we rarely stop to ask, at what cost? Not just the financial cost, the psychological cost, but the cultural cost. The cost to our own sense of responsibility. Imagine a child who is never allowed to fail, whose parents fix every mistake, solve every conflict, iron out every struggle. That child may feel safe, but they will never feel capable. They may grow up obedient, but not strong. Now imagine that child is multiplied by millions, and you'll understand what overgovernance does to a people. It creates a nation of dependents disguised as citizens. And that is not strength. That is a slow, tragic erosion of what makes liberty meaningful in the first place. There's a deeper question here, one that cuts beyond politics and into the core of what it means to be human. What is the purpose of struggle? Because if you believe that life should be frictionless, then it makes perfect sense to want a government that removes every obstacle. But if you understand that struggle is the forge of character, then you begin to see that a government that removes all struggle is also removing the opportunity for people to become strong, wise, and free. We grow by facing things, by failing and learning, by working through conflict and building resilience. When the state steps in too quickly, too often, it interrupts this process. It replaces growth with compliance. It replaces courage with comfort. And over time, it breeds a quiet despair, a sense that nothing we do really matters, because someone else is always steering the ship. But here's the twist. This despair doesn't look like despair. It looks like boredom. It looks like apathy. It looks like the slow decay of civic life, fewer people voting, fewer people volunteering, fewer people creating solutions on their own. It looks like hollow conversation, shallow politics, and a culture more obsessed with blame than responsibility. And the worst part, it feels normal. Because it happens so gradually that we forget what it felt like to be truly alive, truly engaged, truly responsible for our own fate. That is the silent cost of good intentions. Not tyranny in the traditional sense, but the slow numbing of the soul. And once that numbness sets in, we don't cry out for freedom. We cry out for more anesthesia, more government, more intervention, more sedation, and the cycle continues. But it doesn't have to. The antidote isn't rebellion, it's remembrance. Remembering what it feels like to solve a problem with your own hands, to disagree with someone without calling for censorship, and to build something without waiting for permission, and to feel the pride that only comes from voluntary effort, not mandated obedience. That is the spirit that built free societies. That is the spirit that must be protected not just with laws, but with culture, with philosophy, with the courage to say, I would rather face the risk of freedom than the comfort of control. That's not a slogan. That's a worldview. and it's one we must choose again and again, especially when fear tempts us to choose otherwise. Freedom is a discipline, while liberty requires inner strength and moral maturity. Let's strip away the slogans, the flags, the fireworks, and ask a raw, uncomfortable question: are we actually ready to be free? Not just in theory, but in practice. Not just when it's convenient, but when it's hard. Because real freedom, not the kind you chant about, but the kind you live, is not easy. It's not a reward. It's a responsibility. It demands something from you. It requires inner strength, critical thinking, emotional resilience, and moral maturity. And here's the uncomfortable part: if we don't develop those qualities, we will subconsciously invite control. We will ask for a stronger hand to guide us, not because we love tyranny, but because we fear the consequences of our own freedom. In other words, a free society cannot survive without free individuals, and free individuals are not born, they are cultivated. Through struggle, through self-discipline, through failure and course correction. Freedom is not the absence of rules, it is the presence of self-governance. And if you can't govern yourself, someone else will do it for you. This is the paradox that most people miss. Freedom without discipline becomes chaos, and chaos always invites overcorrection. But if people use their liberty recklessly, if they ignore consequences, exploit others, or abandon responsibility, then the culture begins to rot from the inside. And when that rot becomes visible in broken communities, rising crime, economic collapse, people demand safety, and rightly so. But in their desperation for order, they often turn to the very thing that created the problem: more government, more laws, more control. And so the cycle begins again. But here's the secret that breaks the cycle: freedom is not a right unless you can carry its weight. It must be earned, not by a test or a tax, but by the cultivation of character. The strongest government is the one that governs least, because its people govern themselves. So how do we get there? It starts with a shift in mindset. We have to stop thinking of freedom as a gift and start treating it like a craft, something you practice, something you refine. You don't wake up one day and become a competent pilot. You don't become a great artist by accident. Likewise, you don't become a wise, self-governing citizen by default. You have to work at it. You have to challenge your own thinking. You have to learn how to hold competing truths without collapsing into tribalism. You have to take responsibility for what you consume, what you support, what you tolerate. You have to become the kind of person who doesn't need constant oversight, but because you have cultivated the internal compass that tells you what is right even when no one is watching. That's not just moral maturity, that's political maturity. That's the foundation of a strong society. And let's get practical. Think about your everyday life. How often do you self-censor because it's easier than standing for something? How often do you outsource your opinions to influencers, parties, media, or systems just because it's more comfortable than wrestling with hard questions yourself? How often do you blame them politicians, elites, corporations instead of asking, what is my role in this? If we're honest, most of us want the benefits of liberty without the burden. We want to speak freely but don't want to be misunderstood. We want economic freedom but fear competition. We want personal autonomy but avoid personal accountability. But freedom without responsibility is not freedom, it's entitlement. And entitlement is the soil in which tyranny grows. This is why the strongest government is the one that governs least. Not because people are angels, but because they are awake. Because they've trained themselves to respond to life with initiative, not dependency. Because they've built families, communities, and cultures that foster resilience rather than fragility. But because they understand that liberty isn't about doing whatever you want, it's about doing what's right without being told. That's the kind of maturity that makes big government unnecessary. Not because problems disappear, but because people no longer default to the state as the solution to everything. They become the solution not in some romanticized way, but in the real, gritty, daily work of showing up and being responsible. Let's not pretend this is easy. It's far easier to let someone else take the wheel. To say, I'm just one person, what can I do? But that's the very mindset that creates the vacuum power rushes in to fill. The truth is, you matter. Your habits, your integrity, your courage to speak when it's inconvenient, your ability to hold yourself to a higher standard even when no one's watching. That's what freedom needs to survive. Not just laws and documents, but people who embody its values. People who don't just admire liberty, they live it. And they practice it. They pass it on to their children, not just through words, but through example. So I ask you now, not rhetorically, but urgently, what kind of person are you becoming? Are you growing into someone who can carry freedom well? Or are you quietly waiting for someone else to take care of things, to simplify the world, to protect you from the discomfort of choice? These are not small questions. They are the heart of the issue. Because the future of freedom doesn't depend on politicians. It depends on us. On whether we can rise to meet the challenge of liberty, not with rebellion, but with responsibility. Not with slogans, but with self-mastery. But that's the revolution that matters. And it begins within.